Okay, I think I'm more or less right side up. Technology, we love it. Here, the good news. Can you hear me? Somebody tell me if you can hear me. Somebody, if you can hear me, please let me know you can hear me. Oh, Habib says I'm right side up. Angela says I'm right side up. David says I'm good. Okay. Okay, Chaco says we're good to go. So you must be able to hear me if you're answering my questions. Okay, let me just start with a little thought apropos of almost nothing. But as you know, let's see, I got to hang on one second real quick here. I'm kind of on my own here, and so I appreciate your patience. But I'm going to tag the... just need to take a moment to tag the new live stream in the comments of the old live stream so that people can find it. Please forgive me. It's a Saturday afternoon. We don't have the staff here, although I see Angela's online. Angela, I appreciate you joining me for this. Okay, I was just going to say, Kenny Rogers passed away last night, and this is not about that, but as I've had some Kenny Rogers music on repeat today a little bit, I've been reflecting a little bit on his music, and of course I'm at just the right age to have remembered so much of his storytelling songs, and so many are just beautiful and resonate with me. But I didn't remember one song that came across my path, and it had some beautiful lyrics in it that resonate with me more now, especially because of the work I've been doing for the last 8 years. But the lyrics to this song, Slow Dance More, of course, rich with sentimentality, of course, which is the nature of a Kenny Rogers song. But the lyrics go, so love your neighbor as yourself. Don't use money to measure wealth. Trust in God, but lock your door. Buy low, sell high, and slow dance more. Great wisdom to put things into a little bit of perspective, especially in the middle of the coronavirus mayhem that we're seeing. Oh my gosh. Ramon, thanks for the nice comment. I really am eager to get your questions now. Let's see here. A lot of you are worried about the coronavirus, but a lot of us, for a lot of people, the concern is shifting from a concern about coronavirus to a concern about the economy sort of melting down. And that is a legitimate, scary thought. And so I empathize with those of you who are worried either about your health, and I know I have dear friends who are just in a panic about the health implications of the coronavirus pandemic, and of course others who are deeply worried about the economic ramifications. I have a dear friend in Salt Lake County who is susceptible to pneumonia, gets pneumonia fairly frequently, and he is very concerned about getting this from someone who haphazardly might infect him. And the implications for him are dire, he thinks, and it is scary. People with underlying conditions are clearly more vulnerable, and so we want to be thoughtful and kind and considerate and maintain all of this social distancing, not just for ourselves, but for those that we might otherwise come into contact with. Globally, the infection count rose about 10% in the last 24 hours. A little more than that, actually. That's a scary number. If that were to continue for any length of time, even a month or two, the cases will be measured in the millions. So there is reason to be concerned. There is reason for us to be exercising all of the precautions we're now taking against the disease. But of course, those precautions are leading to economic challenges that are not trivial, and we want to be sensitive to those. I spoke with a small business owner the other day who told me that the first coronavirus relief to get passed by the House, Senate, and signed by the President created a very appropriate mandate for some paid sick leave, paid time off up to 12 weeks, which really is an important step forward. And I'm grateful that Congress and the President got together to do that because we have so many people who are vulnerable to that. But as a small business owner, he noted that the way that was being paid for was with a tax credit that he could capture next year in 2021 on his tax returns. And of course, the implication of that for a small business is pretty scary. He's got to pay employees now and can't capture that until next year. So he's applying for an emergency SBA loan. But even in that context, he's not sure where the revenue will come from even to service that loan. So we are clearly not done. The House and Senate are working on a stimulus package. Everyone's talking about it being $1 trillion package. It's desperately needed. There's no question. The economy is literally in first gear. We've downshifted from fourth gear to first gear, and it's going to lurch for sure. There are going to be problems, and so we've got to be as thoughtful as absolutely possible, working on solutions that will work to make sure that we can keep as many people as possible employed, that we can provide benefits to as many people as possible who aren't employed, and that we can continue at the same time to exercise the health cautions that are absolutely needed to keep this pandemic from becoming the #1 killer in the United States this year. That's really what's at stake. I think there is little doubt that the coronavirus is ultimately likely to kill more people this year than car accidents or gun violence. It will be that significant. If we are not careful, it will be the #1 killer of human beings in the United States this year. So it is a scary time. Chaco asked a great question about thoughts on the airline bailouts. Boy, that is such a good question. I think all of us like taking airplanes, and we recognize, at least at some level, that we have a recognition that airlines are an important part of the economy. Of course, while we're all hunkered down, we don't need them, but that means, or need them as much. Delta Airlines has at least reduced their number of flights by 75%. It's just one reference point. So, Chaco, I think the question is excellent. That's what that point is intended to say. As I think about it, I think we do need to support the airline industry, and that means that at least some money has to go to the airlines directly. But I think there are some implications. One is that the United States government, if it puts money in, needs to get something in return. That is probably going to have to be equity in those airlines. That's the only thing that seems to make sense, so that we can get repaid when the economy rebounds. But that is an interesting thing to see. We have some precedent from the Great Recession of 2008, right? The stimulus package that was implemented in the fall of 2008 did include taking ownership in some companies, like GM, for instance, that needed help. And so I think it is wholly appropriate, entirely appropriate, for the government to take ownership in the institutions it bails out. Of course, how much is a key and strategic question, and that will have to be negotiated as best as we can once the bailout funding is approved. So I think that's the answer, Chieko, is that we probably have to do it in order to keep the airlines flying, but that we need to get ownership in exchange to make sure that the people of the United States, the taxpayers, can be repaid. Does anyone else have a question? I thought that was a great question to get us started off. I'm eager to see what other questions you might have. Lots of people watching. Angela asked about if a bailout must contain protections for, let's see if I'm seeing the whole question, but for workers, I guess. And yes, absolutely. If we give money to an airline or to any other company, we need to make sure that the point of that is to keep as many people employed as possible and to protect their rights and interests, not to protect executive pay, executive bonuses, or anything else of the like. Marriott came out and made a dramatic announcement, for instance, yesterday, and Marriott's on the list of those companies that might get some benefit. But they've suggested that they will cut salaries for the executives as they begin to execute layoffs. So I think, yes, we definitely want to tie bailout money to worker protections, Angela. Great question. David asked a question. South Korea is the glaring example of how beneficial early and aggressive testing is. How can we make more coronavirus testing happen in the most affected area of Utah? Great question, David. One of the things that President Trump and the administration did, that to which I give them kudos, is to accelerate an approval or waive a regulatory requirement for Utah companies to begin producing test kits. I believe those test kits are now entering the marketplace, which is tremendous. It's great, and so that should increase the rate of testing. And yeah, the United States still dramatically lags in absolute number, the number of tests done on people who are vulnerable or think they may be sick or may have the coronavirus. And right now, this minute, South Korea continues to test many more people than we are, and of course the United States has on the order of 10 times the number of people. So in proportion, we're just grossly behind, and we need to be doing much more. And in part, I think this reflects a late start because our president didn't believe this was going to be a problem 60 days ago, and it's a shame that he didn't buy it. Hal had a question. A bailout you describe is appropriate, but ought to include a provision that forbids stock buybacks unless the company hold at least some % of their market cap in cash reserves. I think that's a great suggestion, Hal, and certainly worthy of consideration, because the idea that we give a company money and bail them out, and then they maintain low cash balances going forward and aren't in a position to ride out a storm without federal intervention because they're buying back stock is the worst use of cash we can imagine. Yeah, I think that is a great point, and certainly needs to be on the table in the discussions about this. Joe Strain, great question. Asked about how to foster the entrepreneurial spirit to help move forward as a prosperous and successful nation. Yeah, I just couldn't agree more that is an essential piece. And in the short term, I think that gets back to this point I talked about a little bit at the top of the discussion that some may have heard about this idea of making sure that our small businesses have more relief effort. It's relatively easy to give money to the large companies because they are few and far between, and we can identify them, and it's important because they employ a lot of people. But in total, across the economy, more people work for small businesses than for large businesses. And it would be tragic to lose that economic entrepreneurial engine of small business in this country if by not supporting them through that. So the first answer is to make sure that we preserve small businesses by propping them up appropriately through this tremendous economic crisis. This is really an unprecedented economic crisis for small business. I look, I just have to walk around the block I live on to begin to appreciate how devastating this is, because almost none of the businesses around my neighborhood are open now. So in the longer term, Joe, we need to continue to support small business. And one of the things that I want to explore is there are a couple of things that we need to deal with in that vein. One is the rate of entrepreneurship has gone down dramatically and correlates almost perfectly with the mushrooming student debt crisis in this country. If a student graduates from college with a student debt portfolio of $100,000, in fact, the statistics show about $10,000 is enough to prevent a student from choosing entrepreneurship, whereas a student that graduates with less than $10,000 feels free to tackle an entrepreneurial business. And so we've seen a dramatic reduction in entrepreneurship, even as the number of entrepreneurship programs in colleges have exploded. When I was in college, and Joe, you were right behind me, but when I was in college, every program in the country had an entrepreneurship class, but virtually none had an entrepreneurship program or major. Now most business schools have programs, majors, minors, master's degrees. The University of Utah has a brilliant business creation master's program where basically you earn your master's degree by starting a business. So it is clearly tied to the student debt crisis and that is causing this. So we've got to deal with student debt as an issue. We've got to make college more affordable without student loans. We've got to make student loans less burdensome, and I think the key there is to radically reduce the interest rate. The federal government should not be profiting off of students, and that's what's going on right now. Is we've got a huge, it's just a traditional bank spread. The federal government's borrowing at 2-3% and lending at 6-7%. That's ridiculous. There's no reason for the federal government to be in that business. And then on the second real issue that I wanted to get to, Joe, is the way that we tax small businesses, especially very small businesses. We've got to look at the fact that a small business, and Joe, I know you're an accountant, you get this really well, right? It's ridiculous that the first $100 an entrepreneur earns, the first $1,000, the first $10,000, the first $20,000 are all taxed at 18% or 16% roughly, because you've got to pay both sides of the self-employment tax. And that is really a lot of money for people who are struggling. And so I want to work on proposing a plan to cut that in half at least, and to capture that, the second half of the Social Security tax from self-employed people who are much more successful, to shift that burden a little bit, even though that's a payroll tax. It is just, I think, critically important that we reduce the burden of self-employment, especially at the small scale, because more and more people, I mean, think about it, all these gig economy workers who are making very modest incomes are filing a Schedule C and are self-employed and subject to those high self-employment taxes. So we've got to work on that. That's a key thing. Let's see. Any other questions? Let's see. I'm not sure if I've missed any. I wonder, let me click the, looks like they're, how will you make college more affordable? That's a great question. That is a great question, and I think one of the issues has to be that the federal government has to contribute more to public secondary education. I just don't see a way around that. But also some of the incentives in universities seem to be a little bit out of whack. It is a little bit disconcerting to see that the really amazing amounts of money being invested in college campus infrastructure. I think we need to look at how we incentivize universities to put more money into education and reducing cost instead of raising tons and tons of money to build fancy new buildings. Buildings don't teach people, professors teach people, and I'm a little bit concerned about that trend. So I think there are incentive issues, I think there are subsidy issues, and of course I'm not talking about subsidizing or controlling private universities. I'm really focused on public universities, but I use the University of Utah as an example. When I went to college, the cost of school was roughly the cost of a new Civic. Now it's the cost of a new Acura luxury car. It's gone up fairly dramatically in real terms. The inflation above the tuition inflation has been growing for a generation or two now at far above the inflation rate, and we've got to find a way to turn that around. And so, yeah, we've got to address that. But I appreciate you. And David, you make a great point. Online classes will help. And what I think we're going to learn with every university in the country just about is now shifting to online coursework 100%. We're going to learn more in the next 6 weeks about how to do online coursework and make it effective than we've learned up to now through our experiments, because we now have everyone doing it. So, including all of the old gray-haired professors like me that have resisted it, are now doing it by force. And so it will be an interesting thing to see how much of that is kept going forward to keep costs down. And it gets directly back to what I was saying about building infrastructure, right? If we can do more remote learning, we need a lot less classroom space. So great point, David. Thank you for pointing that out. Dayton, you said, do you think the government should take board seats on companies it bails out? What should they do with those board seats if they do? That is a great question, and I would say, yes, absolutely they should, but your follow-on question is good. What do they do with those board seats? But it seems, my first reaction is that those should be exercised by government officials, plain old bureaucrats, perhaps appointed. Maybe it's, the Deputy Undersecretary of Commerce that sits on the board, but we want super competent people, but I think we want people who have no conflict of interest and who cannot and do not profit from or receive compensation from those organizations as a result of their appointment, because that strikes fear into my heart as just a ripe source of corruption. But a great question to look at, Dayton. Great, excellent question. Joe, appreciate your comment on it sounds like I more or less finally got to answering your question, so I'm glad to hear that. Any other questions from people who are watching? I'm thrilled to see so many people watching and participating. We've had great discussion today, great questions. Angela asks, can you talk about the growing commoditization of healthcare, especially in the time of coronavirus? There's a $5 word in the middle of that question that makes me wonder exactly what you're getting at. Angela, why don't you post a reply to your comment and see if I can figure out how best to answer it. Let me see if I can go on to Ricardo's question. What would be the best way to manage illegal immigration? Yeah, I think that is a fair question. There is a little bit of what's going on in this. I'm going to use, let's see, I'm going to step away from that. There is some irony here, and that is during President Obama's administration, he was pretty strict on immigration. He deported a lot of people, especially people with criminal records. He was pretty tough at the border. But his rhetoric was much softer than President Trump's. And so one of the things that was left was, among other things, an impression among people in Central America that going to the United States was something that would always be an option. They could always do it tomorrow. And today they could work on making a better life at home. And so over the years, it was pretty clear that throughout President Obama's term, the rate of undocumented immigration declined, even though he was pretty strict on border controls. Of course, President Trump and his rhetoric about the wall, his rhetoric about the bad people coming over the border, has had an interesting effect. I think he has literally contributed to the increase in demand as he has talked about what happens at the border, because he's created a feeling down in Central America. And by the way, this opinion of mine is fairly educated. I went to Honduras and Guatemala last summer and talked to lots and lots of people, including many people who had attempted and some who had successfully crossed the U.S. border. Some had been deported, some had come back of their own volition. I talked to one guy who had attempted it twice and had been caught twice, and he'd prepaid his coyote for 3 attempts. He had the world's worst coyote, I would say, and I've often thought what they need is a Yelp for coyotes, because there are some that are horrible. They're just abusing people. But in any case, after 2 attempts, he decided not to ever try it again. But I think President Trump did create a fear that tomorrow we won't be able to get into the United States, so we must go today. And so that has actually increased demand. So I think a more compassionate approach can help us reduce the attempts of people coming across the border in the short and the long run. Clearly, though, the solution is for us to address the underlying problems. And our addiction to South American drugs is one of the biggest problems, because that corruption is what creates the violent crime in Latin America. It is one of the key contributors. That is one of the primary reasons it is not safe to live in Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and other countries that are part of the supply chain of illegal drugs into the United States. So we have to get that under control on the demand side. And there are lots of things that can go on there. But clearly, I think one of them is treating drug crimes more like a public health problem than a criminal problem. Because the majority of people in prison are there because, or at least have been involved with drugs. And so criminal justice reform focused on treating drug crimes as a public health problem more than as a crime is, I think, essential to reducing the violence in those countries. We also need to invest. If we had taken the money we were using to build the wall and instead invested in stabilizing the governments in Central America and stabilizing those economies, we would have done more to stem the demand for leaving those countries and coming to the United States. So those are my thoughts, and I think it's a great question, Ricardo. Thank you very much for asking. Angela says, our system makes quality care mostly available to the rich, being sold for the highest price. The insurance companies are covering less and less for more. Boy, isn't that the truth. I am economically, I feel pretty fortunate. I really do. I'm not wealthy by anybody's measure, I don't think, but I feel pretty fortunate. And yet, I have an Affordable Care Act health care plan with a $12,000 deductible. And $12,000 is a lot of money to me. I really do avoid going to the doctor. And so I think our health care system is fundamentally broken. We have, I think, on the order of 33 million people who don't have health insurance in this country. And another 20 million or so who are in my situation, where our deductible exceeds our ability to absorb, realistically, the cost. And so our deductibles are too high for us to actually get the health care we need. So we have a huge problem of affordability and accessibility in our country, even though we've been talking about this issue for at least 30 years. It's horrific to think about. This has been a topic that we have failed to address for so long, and I don't have all the answers, but I will say, as Utah's representative to Congress in the 3rd District, I will fight every day to make health care more affordable and more accessible for individuals. That's the goal. That's where I will play. Because the system is not working, it is not fair. So I appreciate that question. David Dunn asks, big question, how can we create more pragmatic problem-solving culture instead of just a big group of ideologues that can't compromise? Boy, David, if you haven't just hit on my very favorite topic. That is just my favorite topic of all time. I remember working in Washington 30 years ago on Capitol Hill as a staffer and observing the partisan politics there. And I really think it was too partisan a place then. But by comparison, things have completely broken now. At the time, when I was there, people did compromise. The Senate and House got together and passed legislation. And got things done. And what's happened over the last generation, especially, I tend to blame Facebook. And I'm not saying it's necessarily Facebook's fault, but entirely. There are clues that they are guilty of some aspects here. But there was a time when they figured out that the best way to keep us on Facebook was to make us angry. And so they would show us posts they knew would make us angry. So if I posted about politics and said something that was progressive, for instance, they might show you, David, that post because they knew it might make you mad. And so it would get us fighting. They've clearly stopped that. Thank heaven. And I think people are behaving better on Facebook. And I hope that portends a return to more, speaking of $5 words, comity. When I was working in the Senate, I learned this $5 word, comity, C-O-M-I-T-Y. And it refers to this idea of collaborating across the aisle and collaborating and being respectful of those who disagree with us. And I think that is just it is perhaps the most important topic of all. Now, there are some fundamental structural things that actually lead to that. So in addition to Facebook, and I think Facebook is doing better, I mentioned that, I think another thing is redistricting, gerrymandering, right? And in Utah, I'm excited But Utah's just 1/50th of the states and an even smaller proportion of the House of Representatives. But redistricting tends to make most districts, including the 3rd district, generally considered a safe district for Republicans. So most districts in the country are safe either for a Democrat or for a Republican. So the real competition, the real election for the next representative in those districts, those safe districts, is in the primary, where relatively few people participate. And the few who do tend to be either more conservative in the Republican states or more liberal in the Democratic states. Those who vote in primary elections tend to be more extreme, even if the general population in those states is more moderate. So what happens is that most of the people who are elected to Congress now have extreme views and are required by their district to vote in line with those views. And I think that is a real contributor to the problem. And so what we need is districts that are more balanced in terms of Republicans and Democrats, so that the real election every time is in the general election, because that brings the politics in this country back between the 40-yard lines instead of playing from the red zone and always playing defense. And that's put the Senate in the weird position of having one job, which is to block all legislation, because a senator or a group of senators can essentially block legislation from ever passing. So that is a real key thing, is to fix redistricting. And in Utah, there was a referendum last election that created an independent redistricting structure. Now, our state legislature mucked with that a little bit, but the intention was largely preserved, I believe. And the people behind the referendum have essentially signed off on the new legislation. So I think, cross our fingers, we will have better redistricting in Utah, and similar rules and laws have passed in other states. So we're beginning to see two things that I think will remedy our highly partisan politics. One is, I think we're fixing Facebook. We're learning to behave better, and I think Facebook has changed its algorithms, and then I think redistricting. So I kind of went on for a long time, but I think the issue there is, I think that's how we get better comedy. What other questions do folks have for me? Let's see here. Did I miss some? I'm going to scroll through the comments here, see if I missed any. Going back. I'm never 100% sure I'm seeing everything, all the comments. I got that. Got Joe's, got Hal's. Good to see you, Eric, Chuck, John, thanks for watching. Tricia, thank you. Heather, thank you, and thank you for sharing. Joe, great. Dayton, you asked a great question. We saw that. We talked about Angela's healthcare question. She dumbed it down for me, which I appreciate. Let's see. Hal asked another question. Let's see. The current semi-lockdown will likely result in better air quality along the Wasatch Front. Any thoughts on actions we can take to learn something from this involuntary experiment? You know, I've been thinking about that a lot today, Hal, because, you know, the air quality in Salt Lake right now is phenomenal. And I suspect it is across the Wasatch Front just because of this, and probably throughout the country. The economic activity is down, and although airplanes don't contribute much to air quality issues, if the number of flights has dropped 75%, that's the Delta number. If that applies industry-wide, that's a dramatic reduction in carbon emissions, and to some extent, certainly at takeoff, there's a lot of fuel used, and a lot of that hits right in our air quality here in Utah. So, yeah, we're really seeing that, literally seeing that here in Salt Lake County. We can see the mountains on all sides of the valley, which is exciting. We can see the mountains around us. It's spectacularly beautiful. It's a sunny day. It's gorgeous. What do we take from this? Well, first off, we can see that tailpipe emissions really do matter in terms of air quality, because when we stop driving so much, the air quality gets better. So that we've just proven with this experiment that tailpipe emissions are a problem. I drive an electric car. I'm excited about the future of air quality issues because I think in the United States now there are at least 16 different models of electric cars, and all of them, well, all but one or two, will go over 100 miles on a charge, and about half will go more than 200, and a few will go more than 300 miles on a charge. And that is such a concern to people. Now, I sometimes think that concern is a little bit overwrought, but there is an infrastructure challenge. And the Utah State Legislature allocated $50 million of rate-making authority to the Public Service Commission for Rocky Mountain Power to allow it to build $50 million of charging infrastructure in the state of Utah. I think that is absolutely fantastic because that is one of the big barriers to people charging. As an electric car owner, can I just tell you a little bit about how easy it is to make an electric car work? So you don't have to buy any fancy charging equipment at home. Your electric car will come with a regular plug that plugs into the wall, and you plug that into your car. Now, it's going to charge slowly, so that's going to frustrate you for a day or two. But don't panic. Don't panic. What you'll find is that you can't drive enough, realistically, to burn through all you can charge if you keep your car charged up every minute when it's home. If you keep it charged up all the time, charging all the time when you're home, you'll generally wake up to a full battery. On some days, if it's not full, you still have plenty, so unless you've got to go somewhere really far away, you don't need to worry. You've got plenty to go do your errands, to go to work, come back, etc. It really works great. So you're getting all of your energy, all of your fuel at home. So you never have to go to the gas station. Now, if you do a road trip, that sounds daunting and scary because if you drive a gasoline car, you don't see electric chargers. You don't care about them. You don't need to see them. You've never looked for them. So you think they're not there. But they are there, right? They are there. I've done road trips throughout the district, and it's really exciting. I can drive all the way to Bluff on the Arizona border and come back in my little electric car and charge up every time I need to along the way. In fact, if I got up early enough, I could drive all the way to Bluff in one day and come back in the same day, including all the time it would take me to charge up the car. How's that? It is no longer, I assure you, it's no longer. So I'm sorry, I got on my electric car high horse, Hal, and I apologize, but I just want everybody to understand, to your point, that we are proving with this experiment that tailpipe emissions are a huge contributor to air quality everywhere in the world, and I want you all to know that the electric cars that are for sale for today, right this minute, are a solution. I encourage you to look at that. And generally speaking, switching to an electric car will save you money as well. So think about that. You have a car that will contribute, they're more fun to drive. It will contribute to cleaning up our environment, both in terms of air quality and climate change. And somebody's going to say, but you're really powering your car with coal. No, that's not true anymore. Most of the electricity coming off the grid is from natural gas, which has about half the carbon emissions and a fraction of the other pollutants of coal. And coal is being phased out. So we don't need to worry that electric cars are somehow contributing to carbon emissions or to others. And the bottom line is an electric car is about 4 times as efficient as an internal combustion engine. Okay, I belabored that too much, Hal. I apologize for spending 15 minutes answering your question, but you hit one of my really favorite topics. Shannon has a question. We are above the national average in DV homicide in Utah. This is getting worse with the poorest getting laid off and sheltering in place. The violence is increasing. Domestic violence homicide. Yes, that is a shocking statistic, Shannon, and Gail and I have been talking about that a lot. She brought it up. I hope that doesn't mean she considers herself an abused spouse, and I don't mean to make light of this, but clearly this is a scary time, Shannon, and I would love your counsel, and maybe you and I can hop on a call and you can educate me, because I know you are the expert in Utah on this issue, and I would love to have your suggestions for how we can address this right now, because I have been worried about that. So Shannon, I look forward to figuring out how we can do more resources for that. And one of the things that we've got to deal with is in our stimulus package is that the municipalities across the country are going to run out of money. As we wind down our local economies to fight the coronavirus, one of the things that will happen is all of the revenues that they depend on are drying up. And so police, fire, all of those resources will have to be paid for with federal money. And that's a scary concept, but we've got to figure out a way to move federal dollars into municipalities to keep those resources going, or we'll end up with fewer, not more resources available to deal with domestic violence. And I would certainly lobby, Shannon, for doing more instead of less with that focus, because of the acute nature of this shelter-in-place model that is being deployed in most states across the country now. I think we are putting, especially women, women tend to be the victims. They're not always, but tends to be women who are the victims, and men who are the perpetrators, not always, but tends to be, and we've got to protect them. Got to protect them. So that's such a great reminder. And yes, we need more emergency resources, but we've got to figure out how to fund the work that people like you are doing, Shannon, in times like this, because this is an unprecedented thing, and those women especially are really, really at risk. So thank you for raising that topic. Aaron asked about how I differentiate myself from Curtis on climate change. A couple of things. One, I think philosophically, Curtis and I agree on a lot of things. But B, I think Curtis has voted with his party the vast majority of the time. And I'm not sure that his party is ready to deal with climate change in a really aggressive way as is required. Now, I will reiterate, I am extremely optimistic about climate change outcomes here. In part, though, I'm optimistic because I believe that the American people are going to demand action from Congress and from the President, and we will get action. The days when people deny that climate change is a thing are past. It is over. It is done. My Republican friends, thank heaven, my Republican friends are as committed to climate change action as I am. What I don't see is the party, the Republican Party, being as committed to action as my Republican friends. And so I think we're going to have some action led by the Democrats in order for this to come about. And so that, I think, is the key difference. But let me just say, I want to remind everybody, the money we invest in addressing climate change pays dividends, literal dividends. Most interventions have other benefits, other economic benefits. It is not just that it reduces carbon emissions, but it generates other. Think of it in the simplest way, right? The first kilowatt hour that comes off of a solar panel is expensive, right? We all understand that. The second one is free. What people sometimes fail to appreciate is that solar panel will last not 7 years, as some people talk about 7-year paybacks. Some people talk about 25-year paybacks. After 25 years, a solar panel still generates about 80% as much electricity as when it was brand new. It will generate electricity, unless a meteor hits it, for 100 years, right? So, and the energy that comes off after 100 years is still free. The investments we make in clean energy in this decade will pay dividends literally for 3 or 4 generations. And we will live in a world of not just clean energy, but abundant and cheap energy. There are a few, perhaps, on this call who remember when gasoline was less than 50 cents a gallon. It was just cheap. You didn't even think about going to the gas station. That's how filling up your car with electricity feels already today, and it's going to get cheaper. Cheaper, I promise. If we invest in clean energy, very quickly we're going to see the curve where we may have some short-term increases as we invest in clean energy, but the long-term trend will be clean, abundant, cheap energy and dividends for generations. And so I'm excited about where climate change takes us. It's going to be great. It's going to be great. How do I maintain a positive outlook on life with all the turmoil in the world here and at home? Boy, that is such a great question. And there is a tendency in people, in humans, right, for us to look at the negative. Some of us who are a little more left-leaning sometimes get wound up about end-of-days discussions. We don't use that language usually, but we talk about dire results, existential threats from climate change. And we talk about all kinds of things related to that in very dire terms. At the same time, conservatives sometimes talk about violence and other issues in similar terms. It's, the end is coming. But in fact, if we look at long-term trends, there's much less violence in the world today than there was 100 years ago. And I'm really optimistic that as we get control of climate change, which is the biggest threat to that trend, we can avoid the worst case scenarios and keep people living where they live, keep them happy and healthy where they are, and avoid mass migrations of people who can no longer live in places like the Horn of Africa. That's really the first place that is becoming uninhabitable as a result of climate change. But if we get there quickly and begin this trend of reversing climate change, we can keep the world much healthier, much happier, and keep people where they are. So yes, the long-term trends. I was reminded recently reading a book called Factfulness. It's written by a Swedish guy who just recently, in the last 18 months, passed away. But his message was that the trends on almost everything, poverty, global health, life expectancy is getting better, maternal and child health care statistics are getting better around the world. Everything's getting better. The United States is not improving at the same rate, and we've fallen kind of to the middle of the pack in some of these healthcare statistics, which is just another evidence that our healthcare system needs to be tweaked. But globally, the data is just really, really good. And so, I get really excited. So many countries, like Sweden was a poor country just 3 generations ago. It was desperately poor. And now it's one of the most prosperous countries on the planet. And that's happening around the world. The level of prosperity around the world is rising. And so the demand for coming to the United States without documentation is going to diminish if we continue to see that global economic gains around the country, around the world. I get really excited. The future is great. And I'm excited to be a part of helping to nudge the federal government and the tools that we have in the federal government to help people be more prosperous at home and abroad. It's going to be great. So, David, that's kind of my answer to your outlook question. Let's see here. Did I miss any questions? We've been going for a long time, and it's been so much fun because you've asked such great questions. let's see what I've missed here. We talked about the domestic violence, homicide, and yeah, okay, Aaron's question. Yep. Well, it looks like maybe we're done, and I've been going for too long, so we need to wrap up. But let me just thank you all for taking the time. Let me please invite you, if you will, to visit devinthorpe.com. If you're with us, $5, $10, we will use those donations very effectively. We're here to fight for you to make sure we have a proper federal intervention for coronavirus, a proper stimulus package, proper policies to improve global health and Americans' health, to improve and fight and reverse climate change. We're fighting for people without a voice. Please join us. DevinThorpe.com. Thank you very, very much. We'll talk to you soon. I'm Devin Thorpe, a candidate for Congress, and I approve this message.